Let me stay and work for you. If we build a home, we build a future. Welcome to SciFi Nebula, where human hearts keep the lights on when the suns go dim. Tonight's story begins at the edge of a silent estate under an alien sky, Meadowbrook Array, an atmospheric ranch on a thin-air moon circling Epsilon Eridani. A wealthy widow counts her breaths by the thrum of condensers. A giant of a man, built by heavy gravity and hard years, stands at her pressure door with nothing left but manners and a promise: let me stay and work for you. What follows isn't fate painted in starlight. It's a series of brave, ordinary choices: work gloves, repaired pumps, boundaries drawn and redrawn, until an impossible proposal crashes headlong into the oldest human need: to belong. No magic, no prophecy, just two people saying yes when the universe expects them to keep saying no. Strap in. The wind here sings through titanium and rumor. And when the door hisses open, a life can change on the pressure mat. Chapter 1: The Pressure Door and the Giant. Wealth drew people to Meadowbrook Array the way thin air draws frost. Every surface looked brighter for it, and yet nothing felt warm. Lena Hartwell, Lena to the handful who had earned the shortcut, stood at her kitchen viewport with a mug cooling between her palms, watching the condenser spires gleam. They rose in precise ranks across the valley, white ribs catching what little moisture the moon would spare and tick feeding it back to the house through humming lines. On a morning like this, under Epsilon Eridani's diluted gold, the spires looked like a parade at attention. The ranch had been her husband's masterpiece. The lawyers said it was her security now. The empty side of the bed said something else entirely. The outer chime sounded, two soft notes through the house system, and a nearby panel flashed airlock: visitor. Lena stiffened. The nearest homestead sat 17 clicks away. Even delivery drones announced themselves at the service bay, not the front door. She palmed the intercom. State your business. A voice came through, deep and careful, the vowels rounding like a man practiced at making himself smaller. Good morning, ma'am. Name's Jax Sullivan. I heard you might be hiring hands. I'm looking for work. He stepped into the amphibious camera cone as he spoke, and she saw why the voice had been careful. The man filled the frame. He had to duck under the outer lintel when the lock cycled, one hand braced on the soffit with the absent awareness of someone who had spent his life negotiating with ceilings. 2 meters, easy, shoulders like brace beams, a faded workshirt stretched across a chest that had earned its shape hauling more than opinions. His boots were scored from rock, his hat a flattened compromise with the wind, and his green eyes, unexpected as spring, held a steady desperation he was trying very hard to hide. Mr. Sullivan, Lena said, because protocol was a scaffold and she needed one, we're not hiring. Meadowbrook is streamlining. He lifted his hat and ran a hand through hair gone unruly under the rim. He didn't edge closer to the inner door. Smart. Understood, ma'am. If I could trouble you to pass a message along to your ops chief, I can do maint, structural, wind vanes, small pump rebuilds, and I've got certs on light cranes. I don't drink. I don't fight. I work. References? The pause hurt him. She watched it hit, set, and heal, all in a heartbeat. Henderson Array. They shuttered 2 months back. Before that, Helios Wind subcontracts. Another thin pause. There was a misunderstanding at Henderson. Nothing illegal. Nothing that stuck. They won't write me up. The cameras were honest enough to catch his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, she guessed, but from the effort of not begging. You can leave your details with the house, Lena said, working to keep her voice precise, neutral. Caution had kept her safe through condolence calls and condescension alike. It would keep her safe now. Good luck. He nodded once, and the nod had dignity in it. He reached for the outer seal control. Wait, she said, and hated herself a little for the word even as she said it, because it had come from the part of her that still flinched at other people's exits. Where are you staying? He looked aside as if the question had a right answer he hadn't studied for. In my crawler, mostly. Shelter pod at Blue Basin when the wind turns mean. He should have left it there. He didn't. He went to one knee on the pressure mat, not showy, not theatrical. A big man folding himself small. The camera auto-zoomed and caught the wrench at his belt, the scuffs on his knuckles, the way his hat brim shook. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, voice gone rough, "I'll take half wage for room and board. 3 days. If I'm not worth the air by then, I'll be gone and you won't have to ask." Everything in Lena's training screamed the right response, no. A woman alone in a house too big for one heartbeat did not unlatch for strangers, however polite, however desperate. She could hear her attorney's voice reciting liability clauses. She could hear Patricia's, her late husband's sister, saying appearances are currency, darling. She could also hear the empty house listening for itself. "There's an unused HAB module in the east yard," she said at last. "It's sealed, but dusty. You'll clean it before you sleep in it. You'll eat at the mess and nowhere else. You'll report to me at dawn and dusk." His head dropped and rose like a swimmer breaking water. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me yet," she said, and cut the lock. He stepped through the inner door with the caution of a man who knew his size could get him accused of threats he didn't mean. Up close, he was all the things the camera had said and a few it hadn't, a tightness at the corners of the mouth that spoke of hunger disguised as patience, a warm grease smell of machine work no solvent wholly erased, a small squint at the edges of his green eyes that said light and life had both been too bright lately. She walked him to the east yard. The condensers murmured, their white spines drawing whispers of moisture out of the butter-thin air, sending it along capillaries to the storage cisterns. The HAB module squatted under the lee of a low ridge like a stubborn animal that had decided to be furniture. "You'll need a patch kit," Lena said, hands on hips, evaluating the module's sagging seals. "Brought one," he said, patting the holster on his belt where a patch gun sat. He got to work like a prayer, no flourish, no fuss. He peeled back the module's weathered skin, grafted in fresh sealant, retensioned the frame, ran diagnostics with a handheld that had seen better pockets. When the door finally sighed open, a breath of stale air and old dust rode out. He turned back toward her with a question waiting patiently on his face. 3 days, she repeated, because you have to say some things twice to believe you've said them. If you're good, you can earn a week. If you're better than good, we'll see. He nodded. "I won't be in your way, ma'am." "You already are," she said before she could make it pretty. "But I'll manage." He flinched, just a twitch. Then he smiled, not an apology, not even a defense. Just a brief, almost private rearranging of features that said he had heard the line, accepted it, and would try to keep to it. By sundown, a fence alarm pinged along the southern line. 3 posts had shifted in last night's sheer wind and pulled the mesh off true. Lena had been postponing the job because it needed 2 sets of hands and the hired crews had a 2-week wait list. Jax didn't ask. He grabbed a post driver and a coil of mesh and headed for the breach at a ground-eating stride that made the air seem thinner around him. She watched from the kitchen viewport because that's what you do when a stranger is on your land. He moved like a heavy-grav man taught his whole life to set his feet before the world shoved back. When the heat drove him to strip off his overshirt, he tied it at his waist and kept going. Muscle and scar and long patience, everything the frontier respects and quietly punishes. Something unfamiliar tightened under Lena's ribs. She set her mug down too carefully and returned to her ledgers like they could hold the line for her. At dusk he came to the back stoop and stayed outside the threshold like a man who knew doors were not neutral. He had washed up at the hose, his hair sat darker in damp waves. "Report," she said. "South fence is true," he said. The barn ducting to the seed vault had a whistle. "I put a sleeve on it. The north pump is cavitating bad. Bearings will go in a week. I can nurse it, but she'll throw a tantrum if the wind swings east. You have parts. Can salvage from the east sump. It's redundant in this weather. A beat. With your say-so. You have it, she said. And then, because something had to be offered into the space where gratitude would be presumptuous, mess hall is on timer. Food at 1900. Use it. Yes, ma'am. He touched his hat brim and vanished into the twilight like a large fact the dark would take longer to digest. Lena ate alone at the kitchen island out of habit, the house doing its polite best not to echo. When she finally lay down, the condensers purred and the bed held its leftover cold. She closed her eyes and saw a hat brim moving very carefully through a door. She told herself it was the liability talking. She didn't believe herself. Chapter 2, 3 days, 1 week, and a word that means stay. On Meadowbrook, morning began when the wind remembered the valley and the condensers sang a little higher. Lena found Jax already at the north pump, half buried in its guts, a tray of parts laid out in a ritual geometry only mechanics and surgeons understand. He had peeled his sleeves, and the big tendons in his forearms flashed and hid as he worked. Permission to cannibalize the east sump, he said without looking up, voice mild. She'll forgive us. She's fat with redundancy. You already asked last night, Lena said. You have it. He grinned at the pipe flange in his hands. Asking twice builds character. By noon, the pump stopped cavitating and started purring like a machine that finally remembered it knew how. He took a short break in the shade of the cistern and ate without ceremony, protein bar, apple grown under the farm lights, water and long, careful pulls as if gratitude had a rhythm. When he caught Lena watching from 10 meters away, he lifted his bottle in a small salute and went back to work without commentary. Day 2 wrote its own list, fallen mesh at the windward edge, a faulty sensor lying about dew point like a child, a panel in the kitchen that flickered because a wire had loosened itself during a dry thunder night months ago and waited politely to become a problem. Jax moved from task to task with the big patient gait of a man who does not hurry because he knows how to pace himself. He said little, asked only when choice intersected money, and swore under his breath in a way that suggested the swear words were not for show but for companionship. That evening he knocked at the kitchen door and waited. Report, Lena said, grateful for the structure of the word. North line holds. Sensor went back to school and learned its numbers. Your kitchen panel won't lie anymore. He hesitated. And I cleaned out Habist's filters. Wasn't asked. Wanted air that doesn't make a man dream about chalk. Lena tried to imagine the inside of his module without filters. Her throat tightened at the image of a large man asleep and trying to breathe dust like it was a conversation he could lose. You'll submit the extra time, she said. I'll pay it. No, ma'am. Not stubborn, not proud, something quieter. Let me earn my keep before I price it. Price comes after work, she said. That's how grown economies run. He smiled again, small, private. Yes, ma'am. He turned to go, then stopped. If you need me to make myself scarcer around the main house, I will. I don't want to crowd your air. The kindness of it bruised her. Just don't open doors you weren't invited through, she said, because rules keep kindness from turning into something unmanageable. Yes, ma'am. He left, and the kitchen's lights felt too bright for a while. Day 3 broke with a sheer wind screaming in from the flats. The condensers thrummed hard enough to make crockery sing. A mesh panel tore free on the far side of the valley, and by the time Lena reached the ridge in her rover, Jax was there, one boot braced against a brace, both hands sunk in snapping cable. The wind tried to make him a kite. He refused the physics and looked mildly annoyed by them. Need a second set, he called. She killed the rover, slammed it into brace, clipped herself to the anchor line he'd already sunk, and took the free end of the cable without asking. They worked without talk. He let her be strong because she was. When the mesh finally sang back into tension and settled, he tipped his chin at her, respect passing across the space like heat. Back at the house, soaked in dust, they drank water until their ears popped and the world's edges returned from blur. Jax set his cup down carefully. 3 days are up, he said. Do I pack my things or shape up for a week? Lena felt the answer arrive before she decided it. She made it anyway, because that's the difference between a reflex and a life. You shape up, she said. For a week. On wage. In the East Module. His shoulders eased by a measurable degree. Yes, ma'am. She could have left it there. Courage is a muscle, it lifts heavier when you make it. And you may report directly to me, she added. I don't delegate what I can be present for. Yes, ma'am, he said again, meaning it 3 different ways. A routine found them like a trail through scrub. Jax worked the array by day, resetting tripped vanes, checking the dew point stubborn arithmetic, tuning the micromesh where the wind made it hum flat. Lena handled contracts and quotas in the office, lease renewals, water allocation, negotiations with infrastructure over who owed whom how many kilowatts when the sun sulked. Evenings, the house settled into something that wasn't loneliness. Sometimes Lena took a meal tray out to the East Module and sat on the step while Jax ate at the small table just inside, the door between them like a chosen boundary rather than a wall. They talked in easy, unambitious arcs, foster ships he'd grown up on after a collision took both his parents, bulkheads where he'd been too tall at 12 and had learned how to fold without breaking, the way people saw danger first and usefulness later in a body like his. One of my last bosses had a daughter, he said finally, quiet as coil spring oil. She liked breaking things. When I wouldn't be the thing she broke, she told a story about me anyway. Her father believed the story. I left fast enough not to be there when the story learned its own legs. Do you always tell women that? Lena asked, not unkind. Only the ones I work for, he said, and smiled sideways, as if inviting her to notice that he had done nothing but work since he arrived. So they know I'm not a risk to their heir. Women don't need men to protect their heir, she said. Agreed, he said. But sometimes we need men not to steal it. They sat with that in the space a moment. The array hummed. The hum had stopped sounding like loneliness days ago, it sounded like a very large machine reminding itself why it worked. He pointed with his chin toward the condenser spires marching into the drying evening. Was it always this beautiful to you, he asked, or did you have to learn it? I grew up under domes, she said. Beauty was the price you paid to look at the outside. You put your hand to the glass stole your heat, and you called it even. Out here, she gestured at the valley. There's no glass. The world still steals your heat, but at least you can see it coming. He nodded. They watched the light shift across the spines. When she stood to take the tray back, he stood too, out of instinct more than chivalry. He was very large in the doorway and very careful with the space. Ms. Hartwell, he said, the name precise around a question. If I say something wrong, will you tell me? Yes, she said. Good, he said, and seemed to relax into the knowledge like it was clean water. At the end of the first week, he knocked at the kitchen door wearing nerves like a too-tight shirt. Ma'am, he said, hat in hand. I don't want to overstay. Lena looked past him at the line of the yard, the way the dust had learned to lie flatter under his attention, the particular angle of the wind vane he'd set because the old one had lied about where true was. Do you want to stay? She asked, because sometimes the most useful question is the one with the smallest words. Yes, he said, and didn't dress it up. I like working for a place that works me back. You'll stay, she said. It felt like a risk and a relief in equal measures. Full wage. Module housing. Reports at dawn and dusk. She held his eyes because that was part of the contract too. Boundaries remain. He didn't flinch. Yes, ma'am. Something in her unclenched. It surprised her that the something didn't feel like giving up control. It felt like finally exercising it. He tipped his hat, and in the motion there was a gratitude that did not make either of them small. He was almost at the steps when she added, as if the sentence had been waiting for its verb, and Jax. He turned. "Thank you for making things quiet again," she said. His smile was brief and full. "My pleasure," he said. "Not enough quiet in the world." When the door sealed behind him, Lena stood very still in the wash of the house systems and admitted something to herself she had been avoiding since the outer chime first sounded. She had been lonely in a way that money could only decorate. Now, at least for a week, that loneliness had a shape she could name and, perhaps, change. Out in the east yard, the module light winked on. A giant of a man moved inside it with careful economy, laying out his few possessions as if they were enough. The wind slid down the valley and combed the spires. Meadowbrook breathed. The house, for the first time in months, felt like it might learn how to be a home again. Chapter 3, Dry Lightning, Wet Footsteps, and a Line We Don't Cross. 2 months taught Meadowbrook to breathe to a new rhythm. Mornings, Jax's boots thudded past the kitchen at the same minute the condensers climbed into their higher hum. Afternoons, Lena could track his progress by the way the status lamps along the spine flicked from amber to green, one by one, like cautious birds deciding it was safe to sing. In the evenings, sometimes she brought a tray to the east module, stew, bread, something sweet if the day had been cruel. He always met her at the threshold, never inside, never asking the door to pretend it was a wall. They talked about small things that meant large ones: why dew point lies in crosswinds, how grief makes time granular instead of smooth, what a man who grew up on Foster ships misses when the lights go out, the way a hull sings when the temperature swings. It would have continued like that if the sky hadn't decided to write a different script. The ion storm announced itself with a low, bones-deep growl. The moon's thin air turned metallic, the condensers bristled like cats. Static prickled across the fields. Lena pulled up a storm map just in time to watch the red wedge choke the valley. An alarm popped on her wrist: East Module, seal compromise. She was already running when the second alert hit: roof leak, precip infiltration. The rain came hard and sudden, a rare, slanted assault that made the ground suck sounds down into mud. By the time she shouldered into the airlock and hit the manual, Jax was there, hatless, drenched, teeth chattering, eyes apologizing for physics. "Roof peeled," he said, voice knocking. "Tried to patch but the water comes sideways in this kind of wind. You can't stay out there." Lena shoved a towel into his hands and then another. "Guest room. Now." He balked a fraction. "Miss Hartwell, that isn't safe," she snapped, sharper than she meant. "Exactly. Move." He moved, because sometimes you pick a hill to die on and sometimes you pick the hallway to walk down. In the kitchen, he left a wet trail that made the floor squeak. In the guest room, he stood awkwardly in the door, towel around his shoulders like armor he didn't trust. "I'll be fine," he said, trying to hand the safety back to her so she wouldn't have to carry it. "You'll sleep," she said. "That's the rule. I enforce rules." He nodded once, like a man accepting a sentence he secretly wanted. He stepped inside, and stopped. The carefulness that lived in him found the air and made a home. "Lena," he said. She turned in the doorway, startled by her own name in his mouth. He'd never used it. It landed tender and dangerous. "I shouldn't say this," he began, which is what men say right before they say the truest thing they own. "But if I don't, it will sit in the room with me and keep me awake more than the storm." She could have told him not to. She didn't. "I'm in love with you," Jax said, steady now, as if the words had finally found their gravity. "I know that's wrong by every rule we set, by grief, by manners, by work. I know you didn't invite it. But it's in me the way bone is in a wing. I won't use it to pry your life open. I'll keep to the door. I will. I just needed you to know what it costs me to keep it there." The storm pressed against the windows like a large hand looking for purchase. Lena felt heat and cold fight in her in a way that had nothing to do with weather. "Jax," she said, and the syllable was both warning and mercy. I am 3 months from burying a man I promised a lifetime to. I sign your wages. I live alone in a house people already think is a mirror. If you step 1 inch past that door when I haven't asked, the house turns from shelter to mistake. Do you understand? I do, he said, and took a half step back, not forward. I'll pack in the morning. No, she said too quickly, the word leaping out of her like a small animal that had heard its name. She swallowed and made the sentence about rules again. Don't leave the ranch. We maintain boundaries. That's all. He breathed out, once, a dangerous sound and a relieved one, both. Yes, ma'am. She left him in the guest room and closed the door. On the other side, the storm scraped the house down to its studs. On this side, her chest felt like a room someone had opened and not stepped into. She slept badly and didn't get up to check the guest room door. She didn't need to. Some men leak through cracks. Jax did not. Morning came wrapped in a brittle blue. The storm had walked on. The east module looked like a stomping foot had tested its roof and found it wanting. Jax ate breakfast at the mess without comment and spent the day on the roof with sealant and patch web, humming under his breath the way some people pray when they're busy. When the last patch took and the status light clicked to green, he climbed down and reported like nothing between them had changed except the weather. Maybe, Lena thought, that's what grown people look like, change in the marrow, structure intact. That night the house was quiet again. Sometimes quiet is a promise. Sometimes it is a dare. She chose promise. Chapter 4, Reputation, the Algorithm, and a Doorway on One Knee. The storm hadn't finished what it started. It just changed forms. Patricia Hartwell arrived unannounced 2 days later, the outer chime ringing in a clipped rhythm that sounded suspiciously like I told you so. She swept in with a dust-free coat and eyes that turned rooms into inventories. You look tired, Patricia said, which is how people who want you defensive say hello. Her gaze snagged on a pair of large work gloves drying on the kitchen rack. And you've taken in, a circus? A hand, Lena said evenly. He's repairing what the storm tried to ruin. Patricia's mouth made the shape of disapproval without the labor of words. Have you checked ReputeNet today? I don't, Lena said. On purpose. Patricia's wristband lit the room with the pale blue of weaponized concern. A heat map of gossip pulsed. Threads carried names like widow and worker and Hartwell houseguest. Someone had captured a long-lens shot of Jax on the roof, water streaming off him like a carved river. The image had been sharpened and captioned and misunderstood. Appearances are currency, Patricia said, finally saying the line out loud. Protect your account. He works here, Lena said. That's the appearance. Fire him, Patricia said, very gently, like a dentist. Before compassion becomes scandal. Lena showed her the door with more manners than she felt. But the algorithm doesn't leave just because a person does. It sits in the air and pings your name and suggests it to strangers. All afternoon, every device in the house wore a small, insistent number, mentions, 54. By evening, it was 112. At dusk, Lena stood outside the east module with the worst sentence a good person can carry. He answered on the first knock, as if he kept a hand near the latch when she was due. The module was neat, the bed made army tight, 3 books stacked spine out like patience. Ms. Hartwell, he said, stepping back to make room for the place where refusals stand. People are talking, Lena said, because the bad sentence needs a preface. They always do. But this time it's loud enough to dent the house. He didn't look at his wristband. He didn't need to. About us. About appearances, she said. The word tasted metallic. About power and propriety. About a widow and her employee. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He made it be still. Are you firing me? I think, she managed, hating the shape of the next words, it would be best. Silence found all the small noises in the module and asked them to be witnesses: the condenser's distant hiss, the tick of a cooling wrench, the soft mechanical sigh when the air system remembered to breathe. "I understand," Jax said, and his voice sounded like a man choosing not to break furniture with his grief. He nodded once, as if agreeing with someone reasonable he didn't like. "I'll be off your land by dawn." She turned because leaving quickly sometimes hurts less. His voice followed her, steady and wrecked. "Or there's another way." She stopped. Jax. He didn't crowd her. He didn't stride. He knelt, slowly, like a building lowering itself to the ground without losing integrity. The first time, in her entryway, he'd knelt to ask for work. Now he knelt to ask for a life that had work inside it. "Marry me," he said. There was no dramatics hanging off the syllables, just a big man saying a small thing that could change weather. "Jax," she began, and found she had no sentence yet. "I know what it looks like," he said, the words coming easier now that they existed. "A man with nothing asking a woman with everything for shelter. But that's not the math I'm doing. I'm asking to stay and work for you because it's the truest thing I have, to build your array with you, to carry what breaks, to keep doors closed that shouldn't open and open the ones you ask me to. I'm asking to be family, if you'll have one with me." He swallowed. A flush climbed his neck, not shame so much as earnestness overheated. "If you want a child, we'll try, with science where we need it and patience where we don't. If you don't want one, then we will build other things that last. I won't write your body into my promise. I'm writing my own." Her knees felt like someone had loosened a bolt in them. The algorithm was still out there counting and blinking, but the room had become very small and very honest. "People will say I've lost my mind," Lena said, "because saying a fear out loud sometimes shrinks it." "Maybe," Jax said, not unkind. "Are they the people who help you breathe?" "No," she said. It surprised her how quickly the answer came. He waited with the stillness of a heavy grav man who understands that patience isn't passivity, it's applied strength. Lena looked and saw him in all the frames at once, the stranger at her pressure door making himself small so he wouldn't be a threat, the laborer on the ridge refusing the wind its drama, the soaked man who stayed on his side of a threshold because she asked, the boy who'd learned on a foster ship how to hold himself tidy so adults didn't fear him. None of that was performance. All of it was character. "Stand up," she whispered. "Not until you answer," he said, not moving, not bargaining. She laughed once, wet, unbelieving. "Yes," she said, and it shook like a bridge at first and then settled like a landing. "Yes." He rose in sections, careful not to startle the air, and when he took her hands, he did it like a man receiving tools, not tribute. He didn't kiss her, not there, not then. He just pressed his forehead to hers for a long, shameless second and let the doorframe hold them both up. "Thank you," he said, and it carried more weight than any please he'd ever used. "Don't thank me yet," she said, voice steadying. "We're going to make half the county angry and all of ReputeNet busy." "Let them work," he said. "We've got better jobs." They went to Chaplain Unit 7 the next morning because some acts want witnesses who understand paperwork. The unit rendered in soft light and a calm voice. 2 Titan rings cut from a scrap of lattice shone brighter than they looked like they should. "By the authority of the Charter and whatever grace you extend to each other," the chaplain said, "I recognize this covenant. Not a rescue. A choice." They signed. They kissed, awkward in front of an AI and a clerk, less awkward after. They bought coffee at the commissary and sat on a bench like people who had just gotten away with something they're not sorry for. By the time they got home, ReputeNet had figured it out. The number beside Lena's name had tripled. Patricia called twice, then a third time. "You've lost your mind," Patricia said, not bothering with hello. 3 months. A man with no assets. Do you have any idea what people are saying? "I do," Lena said. She looked across the kitchen at Jax, who was disassembling the burner manifold with the kind of attention some men reserve for prayer. He glanced up and smiled, that strange, transformative smile he saved for moments that mattered. The house felt inhabited. "I'm happy," Lena added, and hung up gently, as if setting down a fragile thing neither of them wanted. When she turned back, Jax lifted a wrench in salute. "Ready to work?" he asked. "Always," she said, and they were. Outside, the condensers hummed a new key, or maybe she had finally learned how to hear the old one. Inside, two people who had chosen each other began the first ordinary afternoon of the rest of their deliberate life. Chapter 5, Under One Roof, Under Our Own Rules. They didn't celebrate so much as rearrange. Jax carried his small world from the east module to the main house in a single quiet trip, a bag of tools, 3 books, a shirt he kept for days that asked for better. He set the bag down in the mudroom like a man asking a question and waited for the house to answer. Lena showed him the room at the back, sun in the morning, a view of the condenser spines cutting the sky into patient pieces. "For now," she said, and the 2 words held all the mercy and caution grown people can afford. They made rules because rules make tenderness safe. 2 people at the table every night, even if one ate faster. No discussing ReputeNet at breakfast. Work report stayed in the office, not the hallway. Kissing was allowed in doorways, arguments were not. Jax cooked on nights when the day had pulled Lena thin. He treated vegetables like he treated bearings, with attention and the belief that small adjustments prevent big failures. Lena discovered she liked being asked how she wanted her tea and found, to her surprise, that she liked asking how he wanted his. Outside, Meadowbrook learned their names together. Jax remapped the ducting to stop a backflow that had hummed under the floorboards for a year. He tuned the micromesh along the south line to a new tension that made the wind sing the right note. He moved through the yards with his big, careful body and the air learned not to flinch. Lena, who had spent months forcing herself not to look out the kitchen viewport because all she ever found was absence, began to look on purpose. Sometimes she saw Jax walk the ridge and it felt like watching a promise keep itself. The calls came. Patricia again, and friends who used the word worried the way some people use perfume. Lena listened more than she answered. "You don't care what people think," one friend marveled, half accusation, half envy. "I care what I think," Lena said, and heard the truth ring in her own mouth. At night, the house learned a new quiet, not the brittle kind, but the full kind. When they undressed, it wasn't performance, when they touched, it wasn't proof. He was gentle in the way of a man who knows his strength is not a weapon but a weight he can set down softly. She found herself laughing in the middle of sentences again, not because anything was funny but because relief sometimes wears that face. Jax started keeping a notebook on the counter. On one page, array ideas. On another, groceries. The lists braided without asking permission, graphite calculations next to more cinnamon, a sketch of a condensate baffle beside fresh basil if commissary carries it. It looked like a map of a life he intended to stay for. "Why the notebook?" Lena asked, amused, tracing a fingertip down array ideas until it smudged her skin. "Because I want my thoughts to have somewhere to live," he said, and his grin turned boyish in a way that broke and mended her at once. By the end of the second week, water yield ticked up, 7% by Sorensen's stingy math when he came to check the meters. "You didn't buy that," Sorensen said, baffled and grudgingly pleased. "You tuned it." "Same money, better music," Jax said. That night, Lena brought out 2 Titan rings from a drawer. "The chaplain gave me the option to engrave," she said. "I didn't know what to ask for." Jax turned his ring in the light. "How about, keep the door on mine," he said. "And choose on yours." She swallowed around the lump that rose without warning. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." The algorithm did not stop. It never does. But the house learned to care about different numbers, hours slept, pumps purring, meals eaten together without looking at a screen even once. The small arithmetic of a kept life. On a late shift, Jax found Lena at the office window, brow creased in the way that meant she was trying to keep 3 separate contracts from stealing each other's oxygen. "You run the ranch," he said, setting a cup of tea by her elbow, "and I'll make sure it runs you back." She looked up. Everything in her eased by 1 degree. "That's not how grammar works," she said. "Maybe grammar should learn from ranches," he said, and tapped the notebook. "They get lonely if it's all one way." The house hummed its agreement. Outside, the spires kept standing straight. Chapter 6, 2 lines, thin air, and a new kind of courage. 3 months later, the calendar tried to shrug off a week and failed. Lena, who kept her body's arithmetic in a quieter ledger than any contract, stood in the washroom with a strip of reactive paper that had the power to rearrange futures. 2 lines. Clear as sunrise. Positive. Her first sound was a laugh that broke in the middle and mended itself by the end. The second was a small, involuntary, "oh," as if her ribs had made room for a new tenant on reflex. She didn't call out. She just stood there until Jax found her by the gravity that sudden joy gives off. "What's wrong?" he asked, seeing the tears and misreading them in the way good men do when they haven't learned your newest map yet. She held out the strip. Watched his face run a brief gauntlet: surprise, hope, awe, so naked it didn't know to be shy. "Really?" he whispered, like the word might spook it. "Really," she said, and he went to his knees in that deliberate way of his, not begging, not dramatizing, just accepting the size of the moment by getting low to meet it. He pressed his forehead to the flat of her belly and breathed a thank you that didn't land anywhere but still filled the room. They didn't announce it on ReputeNet. They told 2 people and a clinic. Dr. Hartwell, flesh and blood, not the AI chaplain, was practical and kind. 42 isn't a cliff," he said, "it's a ladder we climb with rails. You'll take radiation chelators suited to your biology, bump your shielding 2 grades on bad solar days, and I want you on supplemental oxygen during storms. We'll check pressure, micronutrients, the whole litany. You're not porcelain. You're a patient. That's better." Jax took notes like he was preparing to sit the exam for her and pass. He reinforced the inner walls with a light lead polymer mesh that didn't advertise itself to guests but made the dosimeter shrug. He rebalanced the air cycle so the house held more moisture, less dust. He installed a soft chime in the kitchen that sounded if the solar index climbed past the level Hartwell didn't like. It made the house feel like a person watching out for them. News slipped out the way good news does, by leak and laughter. Patricia softened around the edges when she arrived with a basket of fruits and the polite fiction that she happened to be in the neighborhood. "So it's official," she said, struggling for a word that could carry both her surprise and her relief. "It's ours," Lena said, and watched the sentence land. Patricia exhaled something she'd been holding since Charles's funeral and set the basket down like it might not be a weapon after all. On the array, men who had never said much to Lena beyond numbers began stopping by the fence to ask questions they pretended were about weather but were really about hope. A miner in a dust-stained jacket handed Jax a little carved amulet and then seemed startled at himself, as if he'd intended to slip it onto the porch and run. "For protection," he muttered. "For them." Jax's eyes went bright. "Thank you," he said, simple and intact. Evenings shifted. Jax's big hands learned the ritual of listening, palm against belly, ear after, a man letting his face be a map he didn't bother to hide. He talked to the small person none of them had met yet in a voice soft enough to make the house listen too. "Hey, Starseed," he murmured, and Lena heard in the nickname all the kindness the world had not shown him when he was small. "I'm the big one. Your other big one is the brave one. We're idiots sometimes, but we will learn." Lena watched and felt something uncoil that had been living in there since the day Charles's grab bike didn't come home. It wasn't that the grief had vanished, it had just been given a chair and asked to sit down while someone else took the floor. On paper, Meadowbrook moved from black to bold black. The yield held. The contracts behaved. The office plant stopped dying. Small wins stacked up until they looked like architecture. On ReputeNet, the chatter found a new key. Worries gave way to watching, gave way to wishing them well from people who would never admit to such a sentimental habit. Patricia made a second delivery, this time ginger biscuits she claimed were for nausea and definitely not an apology. Lena kissed her cheek at the door. "Thank you," she said, and Patricia looked too startled to be offended. At night, with the moons trading places above the ridge, they lay with the windows open to the hum and the honest dark. "Are you scared?" Jax asked, because saying the word lets it sit without running the place. "Yes," Lena said. "And sure." "Me too," he said. "Both." She reached for his hand and put it over the new place where life had joined the conversation. "Let's be scared and sure together," she said. The house agreed, the way a good house does, by keeping the temperature just right for sleeping and not making them get up once. Chapter 7, The Night of Wind and the Work of Being Seen. The storm that broke the gossip found nothing to break in the house, so it went looking elsewhere. Someone cracked the south fence under a moonless sky, 3 posts loosened, 2 bolts pocketed, the kind of sabotage that steals water by degrees and then sells it by the jug. The alarm tripped at 2:14. Jax was already shrugging into his jacket when it did. "Stay," he told Lena, which was a word he rarely asked of her. "I'll be 20 minutes. "Take the floods," she said, and he did. He found the breach by the glitter of stolen dew on the wrong side of the mesh. 2 silhouettes moved where no one should be. They froze at the floodlight and then bolted toward the service canal. Jax did not chase. He hit the canal shut and swung the mesh back into place on habit while the wind tried to tear it out of his hands. He sang under his breath, an old, nothing tune that matched the pull of cable, to keep his arms honest. A cry knifed the dark. Not from the thieves. From the duct 100 meters east, someone had gone into the service run to hide and slipped when the air cycle surged. The run could crush or asphyxiate if you didn't understand how it breathed. Jax was moving before the second cry. He cut the fan at the junction box, crawled into the narrow, angular throat of the duct with a tether at his waist, and found a boy, 18, maybe, pinned in a S-curve, eyes big and wet, breath coming in rabbit snatches. "Easy," Jax said, and the word did what hands couldn't yet. "You're not going to die in here. That would be rude to my schedule." The boy choked a laugh and then sobbed and then held still like someone had told him stillness was a rope. "On 3, Jax said. You curl toward me as if you're about to insult my cooking. Ready? 1, 2, 3. The boy slid free. Jax took the scrape of the duct on his own shoulder to keep the kid's skull from learning a lesson it didn't need. He handed him out to the night, then followed, filthy and grinning and angry in the useful way. "Why?" he asked, not rhetorical, not cruel. The boy looked at the ground. "Quota," he muttered. "My aunt's farm, Helios shaved it in the last audit. We were topping tanks. I thought," he trailed off, shame learning to speak. "You thought wrong," Jax said. "But you get to learn, not drown. Now you call your aunt. She talks to Lena in the morning about kook shares. You show up to help mend this fence at 0800 with both hands. You steal again, I weld you to the mesh. Understood?" The boy nodded, shivering with adrenaline and the sudden, shocking relief of not having ruined his life entirely. At 7:55, he was there, hands up, aunt in tow, apology rehearsed. Lena listened, then did what she did best, turn trouble into a ledger entry and a plan that would keep someone from needing to make the same bad choice twice. By noon, half the valley had heard. Not from ReputeNet, from mouths. The story took on the shape true stories take when they travel fast. The big man didn't hit anybody, he pulled a kid out of a duct and then made him fix the fence he tried to break. He threatened to weld him to the mesh, which everyone agreed was probably a joke and also probably not. Patricia watched the repairs with her arms folded and her mouth unclenched. "I misjudged you," she said to Jax, which for Patricia was a sonnet. "Or rather, I judged the size of you and let the rest fill in with nonsense. I've been filled in with worse, he said, not unkind. Glad to be corrected. She nodded, then added, almost shy, I brought soup. She handed the thermos to Lena, who nearly laughed from relief at this strange, ordinary generosity. By evening, Sorensen posted a dry note to the public channel, South Line incident resolved. No loss to quota. Cooperative inquiry into audit practices scheduled. Coffee will be served. Bring your own cups. The man could turn justice into a meeting and still make it feel like a win. The number beside Lena's name on ReputeNet didn't drop, it tilted into a new category altogether. Not spectacle. Steadiness. As dusk stitched the ridge back together, Jax sat on the east brace with his feet braced against the wind and watched the spires refuse to bow. Lena climbed up and sat beside him, their shoulders making a perfect, familiar geometry. You didn't chase them, she said. Wasn't the point, he said. The point was the fence and the boy. They'll still talk, she said, but there was no fear in it anymore, just the recognition that human mouths are weather and you build for weather, not against it. Let them, he said. He reached for her hand, then for the small rise under her shirt where tomorrow was practicing its hello. The baby rolled like it had heard something worth answering. The wind sang the note he'd tuned it to weeks ago. The array held. The house behind them glowed. Ready to go see about that coop meeting? Lena asked, smile crooked, eyes clear. Ready, he said, and stood, big, careful, sure, because that's what men like him look like when the world finally lets them be seen. Chapter 8, A House That Knows Your Name. The Valley learned a new word, cooperative. They didn't make a speech about it, they drafted. In the machine bay, at a table that still smelled faintly of solvent and cinnamon, Lena slid a sheaf toward Sorensen. Charter, she said. Meadowbrook Cooperative. We put 10% of array output under community governance, build a buffer so no family has to choose between quota and shame again. Sorensen adjusted his glasses like they were responsible for the comfort in his eyes. Bylaws are dull, he warned. Make them righteous, Jax said. They signed under Chaplain Unit 7's soft glow, Lena, Jax, the boy from the duct with scabbed knuckles and a careful signature, a handful of neighbors who'd spent their last 3 storms learning each other's middle names. Patricia stood at the back with a thermos and a posture that said she'd come in case anyone needed a seat to argue from. Halfway through, she sat because no one did. By the authority of your own promises, the chaplain said, this cooperative exists. Be gentle with your rules, stern with your temptations, and fair when you forget how to do either. They clapped like the sound might convince the paper to hold. It did. The co-op meeting that followed looked like 100 human gatherings in 100 scattered towns, coffee that had worked too hard, second-hand chairs, babies fussing at the edges, a whiteboard that squeaked. They argued about audits without letting the argument turn into a weapon. They set prices that didn't punish the wrong people. They named a committee with a name so boring it couldn't possibly be corrupt. Later, when the room had emptied of opinions and only the smell of them remained, Patricia lingered at the door. You're very sure of him, she said, eyes on Lena and only sometimes flicking toward Jax like she might spook if she looked straight at him. I'm sure of us, Lena said. Patricia nodded as if this, finally, was a currency she recognized. Bring the biscuits tin back, she added, which is how some apologies dress when they're not ready to say their names. They didn't stop being busy just because they were happy. Meadowbrook never let anyone pretend work was optional. Jax took 2 days to rebuild the east module's roof properly, not because he missed it, but because he didn't want any version of the man he used to be sleeping under a bad seal on someone else's land. He left a spare patch kit on the shelf anyway. Old habits. Better ones. He and Lena carved new paths into the same old day, morning notes on the counter, her tight handwriting under his block letters, contract signed. Check South Vein. Vein true. Lunch at 1300, a conversation with pen and paper that made the house feel literate. He took the rings to be engraved by a jeweler who mostly did valve seats and liked the challenge of sentiment. When he slipped Lena's back on, the inside read "Choose" in letters neat enough to make the world feel possible. His read "Keep the door." They both read "Home" without needing ink. The baby made itself known with thumps that felt like punctuation marks. Lena learned to stop mid-sentence and put a hand to the place where a new one wanted to be. Jax pretended not to tear up every time he failed, politely. "Name?" Lena asked one night, listing possibilities on the back of a maintenance requisition. Jax looked at the list the way he looked at spires before a storm, with respect for what names can hold and break. "Let's meet them first," he said. "I don't want to force a good name on the wrong person." "Practical and romantic," she said. "Dangerous mix." "Only for people who think those words are opposites," he said, and kissed her hand because kisses were still allowed in doorways and because the kitchen counted. On ReputeNet, the noise didn't stop, it changed pitch. The hot takes cooled. People posted pictures of fixed fences and full tanks instead of long-lens shots of bodies that didn't belong to them. A miner wrote 3 sentences about getting his aunt onto the co-op waitlist and ended them with, "Didn't think we were that kind of place," and the post carried its own weather. Helios sent a man in a jacket so gray it seemed embarrassed to be a color. He smiled around the co-op paperwork like a person practicing for friendlier planets. Lena read his offers and declined the parts that would have worn their generosity as a leash. He left with handshakes and no leverage. Winning didn't look like somebody losing. It looked like staying. Hartwell the doctor added a new line to Lena's chart, maternal stress, trending down. He didn't comment on the reason. He tapped the number and stood back like a gardener who's learned when to get out of the way of growth. The night before the first harvest under the co-op charter, the wind came up clean and cool, as if the valley had opened a window in its own chest. Jax and Lena climbed the east brace because they'd taken to marking big days from up there, where the spires stood at eye level and the rest of the world remembered it was small. Below, the array glowed, little status lights grinning in rows. Above, 2 moons argued politely about who got which side of the sky. Between them, the baby kicked like a person rehearsing for hello. "Do you ever miss the life where you only had to take care of yourself?" Lena asked. "I wasn't very good at it," Jax said. "Too much space, not enough shape." She leaned into him and felt the big, cautious body that had learned how to be brave without turning into a weapon. "We made shape," she said. "We did," he agreed, and looked out over land that had decided to trust them back. He told the story the way he always told the good ones, out of order, like memory with the boring parts subtracted. The pressure door and the man kneeling not to be smaller but to make his promise larger. The storm that threatened the roof and not the rules. The algorithm that blinked and eventually learned there were some names it couldn't spend. The co-op where meetings were weapons that chose not to cut. The boy pulled from a duct and returned to his body with a shaky laugh and a future. "People will still talk," Lena said. "Let them," Jax answered, and rested a hand where the kicking lived. "We'll keep the door." The wind shook the lattice and found it sound. The hum ran through them like a very old song that had finally learned their names. Behind them, the house lit the path down with a soft spill that said "Come home," and ahead of them the ridge held, and under their hands the brace didn't flinch, and for a long moment the only arithmetic that mattered was 2 people plus 1 small beating thing plus the work that would greet them in the morning. If stories like this, human hands building steadiness in thin air, give you something to hold, choose to keep the door open with us, like, subscribe, and drop a short comment for SciFi Nebula so we can keep making more homes out of hard weather.